Hi, my name is Sam, and today we are going to be taking a look at Truthy and Falsey in JavaScript. So if you have done any JavaScript development, you've probably come across the terms Truthy and Falsey. You've heard people talk about values and their truthiness or their falsiness, right? So what exactly is this all about? What is Truthy? What is Falsey? How are they used? And all of that. So in this video, we're going to do a few things. To begin, we're going to take a look at the mechanics of Truthy and Falsey. We're actually going to dive into the ECMAScript specification, and we're going to take a look at how truthiness and falsiness are determined. Secondly, we're going to take a look at some actual code, and we're going to see how you can use truthy and falsiness to write better code. And finally, we're going to take a look at some caveats and potential pitfalls around truthy and falsy, because JavaScript does some interesting things around determining whether a value is really true or false, which ties in a lot to generally how JavaScript handles type conversion, which can be confusing to newcomers. So that's it. With that said, let's dive into it. All right. So with that said, let's actually take a look at truthiness and falsiness and get a big picture idea of what is going on here and why this is useful. So really, truthiness and falsiness relate to a behavior of JavaScript, which is the ability to take any value and convert it into a Boolean. Right? So for those of you who may not know, a Boolean is really just a true or false value. Right? Generally speaking, most programming languages have a Boolean value type, and the values for those value types are either true or false. Right? So JavaScript has the ability to take any value of any type and convert it into a Boolean. And so there's actually a set of algorithms that ECMAScript specifies that is used to determine if a value is true or false. All right? And so one of the things that's really important if you're going to understand truthiness and falsiness in JavaScript, you've really got to understand that algorithm that is how JavaScript determines if a value is true or false. And luckily, it's totally simple. It's really spelled out for you in the ECMAScript specification if you want to take a look, which we'll do right now. All right, so if we're going to understand how JavaScript determines whether a value of a given type is true or false, we need to understand the algorithm that ECMAScript specifies that's used to do this, right? So I guess before we look at the actual algorithm that determines whether a value in JavaScript is true or false, I think that it's important to preface this with a few things. One, JavaScript, like all programming languages, has a certain number of base types, right? These are primitives, and there's also objects in JavaScript. So in order for this to make sense, you should really be familiar with JavaScript's base value types. And you probably are, right? Those are things like number, string, undefined, things like that. So really there are only 6 primitive types in JavaScript, and then there are objects. So in total, as of 2017, there's really only 7 basic types of values that can exist in a JavaScript application. So it's not like you have to memorize a crazy amount of things or anything like that. But just as a caveat, it's important to be familiar with those base value types in order to understand how those types are converted from their original type to a Boolean, true or false. So let's take a quick look at the algorithm chart for how JavaScript determines whether a value is true or false. All right, so as you can see here, we have a simple table. In the left-hand column of this table, you can see that there are 7 types specified. And again, these are the 7 base types that exist in JavaScript. 6 of them are primitives, and then the final one, object, is not a primitive, but it is definitely a type. So really, when JavaScript is doing its thing and it asks the question, is this value true or false, right? Really, it goes through this table and it says, well, what type do I have, right? And then potentially what value of that type do I have? And then it performs the conversion from the original value and type to a Boolean, right? So again, let's make sure we step back and just understand the big picture. Truthy and falsy in JavaScript really just relate to if this value, right, is converted to true when asked, is this thing true or false, right, then it is truthy, right? Meaning that if I have a string that says my name, right, that is a type of string with a value of my name, but when asked, is that true or false, that string will actually convert to true, right? And so in that sense, we're saying that the value, right, the string that I have is truthy, right? It's not true, right? It's because it's not a Boolean. But if I force it to become a Boolean, if I coerce it into a Boolean, it will coerce or convert to true. So in that sense, we can say that that string is truthy, right? Which is why you can see why there's that terminology of truthy and falsy, right? They're not exactly true and false, but they are convertible. They are coercible to true and false. So let's just go through real quick. I'm sure you can see what's going on here, but basically undefined is a type. It has one value, which is undefined, and undefined, if asked to, if you coerce undefined into a Boolean, it's false, right? Undefined is false. Null, again, is a type of null. It has only one value, which is null, and if it's coerced into a Boolean, then null is false, right? Booleans are already of type Boolean, so we don't need to coerce them into a Boolean. They already are what they are, true or false. A number, right? This is interesting. All numbers are true unless they are 0 or not a number, right? Not a number, that NaN is a weird thing in JavaScript that a lot of people aren't fans of, and I kind of agree. But not a number is technically a number of type number, which you can definitely see the issue some people have with that. But if you ask not a number to coerce into a Boolean, then it does coerce into false, as does 0. Strings are interesting. Again, all strings are true, right? A string of any length greater than 0 will coerce to the Boolean true if asked to do so. With that said, an empty string, a string with a length of 0, is false. So with the number and string examples, we can see that when JavaScript asks the question, is this value or type true or false, it has to look at potentially two things, right? One, it has to look at the type, right? What type do I have? Is it a number? Is it a string, etc.? But then that's not enough, right? In the case of number and string, just knowing the type is not enough to know whether the value is true or false. We also need to look at the value, right? Because like we've seen here, just because it's a string, I don't know if it's true or false. If the string has a length to it, if it has any characters in it, then it's true. But if it doesn't, if it's an empty string, then it's false. So this is part of the algorithm of how JavaScript determines is something true or false. Symbols and objects are always true, right? The last two here. So even an empty object, right? An object with nothing in it, right? You can use the JavaScript object literal syntax and just create an empty object with no properties, no methods, nothing. But if you ask JavaScript, is that empty object true? The answer is always yes. All right, so with that said, now that we kind of have an idea of the algorithm that JavaScript uses to determine whether something is true or false, let's take a look at some common ways that this is useful when actually writing code, so that you can recognize it if you're looking at others' code, and you can use it yourself to write better code. All right, so with all of that said, let's take a look at some concrete examples of how you can use truthiness and falsiness to write good code. So really, a main use of truthiness and falsiness is when an expression is getting evaluated in something like an if statement, right? So let's say, for example, and we'll turn to the code here, let's say, for example, that we have a basic if statement, right? And the if statement asks if true, then we're going to console.log something, right? So we can just say hi. And just to be clear, I've got a simple setup here, just a local JavaScript file on my system, and then I am feeding that JavaScript into a node console here, where I'm just going to use that to output stuff, and we can play around with it. It's an easy setup. Cool. So I've got this expression. If true, then console.log hi. So if I go ahead and call this, then run this file, we can see that we do get the console.log of hi. So, okay, really basic. But what's actually going on, right? The if statement is actually evaluating the expression that is between the parentheses in this case, right? It's evaluating that expression. Okay, so evaluating the expression, what does that actually mean, right? Well, the if statement actually needs to coerce the return value of whatever expression is inside the brackets, the parentheses, I'm sorry, to true or false, right? So that's a little weird if you think about that for a second. The if statement requires that at the end of the day, whatever is between its parentheses has to be converted to true or false, right? So what happens if I pass something to an if statement that is not true or false, that is not of type Boolean, right? Well, let's actually take a look. So I'm going to change this example, and instead of saying if true, right, this will always run because true is always true, let's pass in something interesting. What if I pass in the string, right? So now I'm asking JavaScript, if string is true, right, essentially, then run this console.log. Okay, so I'm going to save this and I'm going to run my console again, and we get hi. So looking at this, we understand that the JavaScript engine is actually coercing, it's evaluating the string that we've passed in, and it's forcing that string to become a Boolean, right? In this case, we know based on the algorithm chart we just looked at that a string with a length greater than 0 will always evaluate to true, right? This string is truthy, right? It's not true. It is a type string. It has a value of string, right? It is not a Boolean. It is not true or false, right? But it is truthy in that when the JavaScript engine forces that string to become either true or false, right? You can't choose. You either have to be true or false. You must coerce to one of those, right? When that hammer falls and JavaScript has to force this value into true or false, it is true, right? So it is a truthy value. To test this, right, we know from the algorithm chart that a string with a length of 0 is falsy, right? Meaning that it's still a string, the value is still an empty string, right? That's all true. But when forced to become a Boolean, an empty string is coerced to false, right? Let's test and see if that's true. So if I delete the contents of the string, we're still saying if empty string, right? Should we see console.log? Should we see anything log out? Let's take a look. Just to be clear, I'm going to clear my console again, and we'll run this one more time. Run. We see nothing, right? So why exactly do we see nothing, right? We see nothing because when the JavaScript interpreter gets to this portion of code, it evaluates the expression between the parentheses in the if statement and asks the question, at the end of the day, is this expression, is the value that's returned from this expression true or false, right? And if the value that it's dealing with is not a Boolean, right? If it's something else, if it's a number, if it's a string, if it's an object, right? Then JavaScript has to basically coerce that value to a Boolean, true or false. So in this case, when it sees an empty string, it says, well, that's a string. And really, for an if statement to function, it needs a Boolean, right? So it coerces the empty string to false, and then the if statement does not run. Cool. All right, let's take a look at one more code example of where truthiness and falsiness come into play. And this is a really common one. This is a really big one. And that is logical operators. So what exactly are logical operators? You've probably seen them, but let's take a look. One really common logical operator is the AND operator, which is the two ampersands, right? So it's and. And really what that says is I will return true if A and B are both true, right? A and B must both be true for this expression, this operator, to evaluate as true. Right? So a common use case of that might be something like this. Say we have an if statement, and then in here, right, we have another console.log, and we'll say I'm true. All right. So in this case, right, the if statement will execute, its contents will execute if and only if A and B both are true, right? So in simple use cases where we're dealing with Booleans, right, that's easy. That's really straightforward, right? In this case, right, we have if true and false, then execute my console.log, right? Well, obviously both true and false are not both true, right? Because true is true and false is not true. So that's clear. What's more interesting is when we start dealing with types and values that are not Boolean, right? So what happens, for example, if I do this, right? My name is Sam. So what happens if I say if true and Sam, string, 3 letters? Would you expect that to execute? Let's take a look. So I'll run the file. I'm true. So what's really going on there, right? Again, for an if statement to execute, the expression passed to it must evaluate to true, right? Inside the if statement, we have a logical and operator, right? This operator has 2 operands, one on the left of it and one on the right of it. In order for that expression, right, A and B, something and something, to evaluate as true, both of the values passed to it must be truthy, right? They don't actually have to be true, right? Which we can see in this example. I'm passing a Boolean on one side and I'm passing a string on the other. And yet that totality, that expression, is evaluating to true. So again, under the hood, under the covers, what is JavaScript really doing, right? It's saying this logical and operator, right? I, at the end of the day, need to determine whether both of my operands, the one on the left and the one on the right, are true, right? So for values that are passed to me that are not true, I need to actually coerce them into a Boolean, right? I need to actually coerce them into true or false, right? And again, it uses that table that we looked at. It uses that algorithm chart to determine, based on the type and based on the value, is this value true or false, right? And so again, in this case, we have a string with a length of greater than 0, so it evaluates, it is coerced to true. So this expression executes. So again, like our previous example, if we remove the contents of our string and we just say if true and empty string, right, then console log this content. If we do that, and I'll execute the file again here, nothing happens, right? So again, this logical operator and is looking for both the item before it, the operand before it, and the operand after it to be true. And if they're not, then it will not evaluate in totality as true, and the if statement will not execute, right? And we could do the same thing, right? We could pass in a number, 13, right? Should this evaluate as true? Let's see. It does, right? And that's because all numbers of all values are coerced, are truthy, right? They evaluate to true, with the exception of 0 and not a number, right? So if I pass in true and not a number, should this execute? Let's see. No, it does not, right? And that, again, is because not a number is of type number, of value, not a number, but it is not truthy, right? It is falsy, meaning when forced, when pushed against the wall and told you have to be either true or false, what are you, right? It says, okay, I'm false. Let's just do a few more examples to make sure we understand. in JavaScript, you have the ability to create what is called an object literal, right? Which is basically the curly open brackets and curly close brackets. And inside of that, you could put properties or methods inside of your object, but you could also just have an empty object, right? So this may look a little weird just to have this, but really this is an empty object literal, totally valid JavaScript, right? And in fact, it's truthy, meaning that when JavaScript looks at this empty object and asks the question, are you true or are you false, right? An empty object is true. It's truthy, right? So if we save this, and I'll clear my console again, and if we log this out, you see that we do get our console.log, because as far as JavaScript is concerned, true and empty object evaluates to true. So, likewise, there are other logical operators. There's the OR operator, which is a little different than the AND. The AND requires that both operands be true in order for that expression to evaluate as true. The OR operator only requires that one of them be true, right? So in this case, I could pass in a falsy value, like what's one that we haven't done yet? We could pass in undefined, right? So undefined is a type and value in JavaScript that is falsy, right? It's not a Boolean, it's not false, but it is falsy in that it evaluates to false. But the OR operator only requires that one of the operands, either the one on the left or the right, be true. So in this case, we should expect to see that the if statement executes, which it does. All right, so hopefully looking at some of the truthy, falsy coercion behavior, especially when it relates to statements like the if and while statement, and also the logical operators. Hopefully that makes it a little more clear to you why this behavior is necessary, right? It really creates the opportunity to write more flexible code because you don't actually have to pass in literal Booleans into your statements and operators. You can pass in other types, and JavaScript will actually manage that process of coercing different types and values to Booleans. All right, so to wrap up, let's just take a look at a few caveats to keep in mind when thinking about truthiness and falsiness in JavaScript, and how JavaScript determines if certain values of certain types are true or false. Because I think that, again, once you understand what JavaScript is doing and why, it is fine. It makes sense, right? But it can be a little disconcerting or off-putting initially because certain things are true that you might think would not be true, and certain things are false that you might not think are false, right? So let's take a look at a couple examples that I think might be a little weird, and again, just really drive home why the truthiness or falsiness of them is the way it is, right? So let's take a look at some code. You can see up here, we've got the same if statement that we had previously. Because true is passed into the if statement, this will obviously always execute. But let's do a few interesting things, right? We saw one previously, which is empty object, right? So empty object evaluates to true. An empty object is truthy, right? Even though it has no content, right? And in my eyes, you could make a strong argument that an empty string is falsy, right? An empty string, a string with no content, is false. So why is an empty object, an object with no content, true? These are interesting questions, and every language has its quirks, but these are just things to keep in mind, right? An empty string is falsy, it will evaluate to false, while an empty object, as we can see here, if we test it, will evaluate to true, and our console.log shows up in the console. So interesting. Other things to keep in mind. False, the actual Boolean type false, is obviously falsy, right? Because it's already a Boolean, it's already false. But if we put in the string false, right, and we run that, I'll clear my console out. If we run this, we see that our if statement evaluates the string false as true. So really, the string false is truthy, right? And actually that makes sense because false is type string, and the length of that string is 5 characters, right? And we know from our algorithm table that only empty strings are falsy. Only empty strings evaluate as false, right? So as long as our string has 1 character in it, it's truthy. So really, from that context, false is just a string, right? So it's truthy. Similarly, 0, right? We know, and we'll test this out, that the number 0, right? This 0 between the if statement parentheses here is type number, and its value is 0, right? So if I clear my console again and we run this, we don't get our console.log, right? And that's because 0 is falsy, right? 0 evaluates to false. But if we put the 0 inside of a string and save that, I'll clear my console and we run it, we do see our console.log, right? So again, what the heck is that, right? Well, it makes sense. Like our false example, this 0 is actually type string with a length of 1, right? And we know based on our algorithm table that we saw previously that as long as a string has more than 1 character in it, it is truthy, right? It is going to evaluate, it is going to be evaluated, it's going to be coerced to true, right? So really, that does make sense. Similarly, we can look at an empty array, right? An empty array, like an empty object, will evaluate to true. And similarly, a function, right? So we could say if function, and we pass in nothing, right? That looks pretty weird, but let's see what it does. It evaluates to truthy, right? So these are all interesting things, right? An empty string is falsy, but an empty object is truthy, right? An empty array is truthy. An empty function is truthy, right? So the good news is that there are not infinite possibilities here, right? Again, JavaScript only, as of 2017, as of ECMAScript 6, 2015, there are only 7 types, right? And so you just need to get familiar and comfortable with that algorithm table, and it's pretty easy to understand how JavaScript is going to be modifying your values and coercing them. But you definitely want to be familiar with this, because if you're going to do any kind of serious JavaScript development, you're going to be working with different values of different types from API data, from where user input. And if you don't understand values and types, and you don't understand how JavaScript is viewing those different values of different types and coercing them into true or false, determining their truthy and falsiness, it's going to be really confusing, right? So really go back to that original ECMAScript specification and algorithm table that we looked at, and make sure you understand for each of the different types and different values how JavaScript is determining truthiness and falsiness. And if you understand that, then you understand the concept and you're going to be a boss. All right, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did enjoy it and find it valuable, that's great. And I hope that you will subscribe and give the video a like, as that's much appreciated. And I will see you next time. Thanks.